J. Ted Hartman, an 18-year-old civilian, had been swept into a military machine. This machine operated on shifting sands and broken assurances. His clerical aptitude briefly offered a reprieve in the form of the Army Specialized Training Program. This program was a temporary academic haven at the University of Oregon. But the Army's needs were fluid and constantly changing. The promise of a 6-month education shattered after only 2 months. This arbitrary decision scattered hundreds of students across the country. It cemented the soldiers' deep-seated understanding that the word of the Army was unreliable. Duty, he realized, was dictated solely by the exigencies of a global war. The transition at Camp Cook, California, was chaotic. It was a harsh baptism into armored life. Hartman was classified and retained in armor despite his hope for the medical corps. He was thrust immediately into the demanding regimen of tank training. He quickly mastered the M4 Sherman tank. He learned to wrangle the wide track modifications that General Patton had mandated to prevent the tanks from bogging down. He sweated through desert exercises in filthy and crusted gas masks. He learned to listen for the telltale signs of the unreliable Continental radial engine threatening to stall. It was here, amidst the dust and the constant mechanical grind, that the former students were stripped of their academic identities. Men like McHugh, Sumners, and O'Loughlin were forged into a cohesive unit. They were forever melded together by shared hardship. The final definitive break came in late September 1944. After a brief but precious furlough, the 11th Armored Division boarded the ancient troop transport HMT Samaria. The voyage was miserable, cramped, and sweltering. It was punctuated by awful meals. Yet the sense of purpose among the men was clear. They arrived in a rain-soaked England. There, the tedious work of cleaning the protective cosmoline from new Sherman tanks began. It was a mundane task performed under the persistent, morale-sapping English drizzle. Their initial orders pointed toward a relatively safer assignment in southwest France. This prospect offered a sliver of hope to the division. That hope evaporated in mid-December. Hitler's desperate gamble, the Ardennes offensive, had ripped a massive hole in the Allied line. This created a sudden, urgent need for reserves. The 11th Armored Division was immediately rerouted. Their destination shifted instantly from the quiet rear to the center of the German breakthrough. The sudden change unnerved every soldier. They were no longer training for war, they were now entering it. On December 19th, they sailed from Weymouth on LSTs. They crossed the Channel and began one of the most brutal movements of the entire campaign. This was a grueling 450-mile forced march across northern France. The journey was relentless, an 18-hour marathon in open vehicles. The freezing weather was compounded by overcast skies and intermittent snow. The snow coated the fields and slicked the roads with treacherous ice. This sent heavy vehicles sliding precariously. They arrived, exhausted and chilled to the bone, in Soissons on Christmas Eve. They were pushed onward almost immediately. By December 29th, the division was moving toward Belgium. They were desperately trying to link up with the beleaguered American forces. That night, near Longlear, the men bivouacked for what was the 7th consecutive night of restless, frigid sleep. The cold was absolute and consuming. Ink froze solid in pens. The wool uniforms offered insufficient protection against the damp, penetrating chill. The soldiers performed final anxious maintenance on their tanks. They checked tracks and engines in the half-light. Sleep was impossible because the cold was a constant, painful distraction. But the anticipation of combat was worse. The air was thick with the low, continuous rumble of heavy artillery. This sound, though distant, vibrated through the frozen ground and settled deep in the pit of every stomach. They ate sea rations, cold, unappetizing tins of processed food. Few men had the appetite for them. This was the final moment of quiet before the storm. The men, who had been students and clerks just months earlier, were now hunkered down in the deep snow. They were preparing to drive 33-ton steel machines into a desperate, confused melee. Every man knew that when the sun rose on December 30th, the firing would no longer be distant. This frigid bivouac was the threshold between the chaos of deployment and the rude awakening of their first combat. It was a moment where the bonds of their camaraderie were tested against the silent, terrifying certainty of what lay ahead. The morning of December 30th, 1948, northeast of Neuchâtel, Belgium, shattered all remaining illusions of military order. The 11th Armored Division had been rushed to the front line as reserves. They were thrown into immediate, intense combat. It was a brutal, rude awakening for men still reeling from the forced march. The initial attack was a confused, chaotic affair. It was characterized by a severe lack of artillery and infantry support. This forced the tank crews to advance without the crucial protection they needed. The distant, vibrating rumble of guns instantly became a deafening, localized roar. Anxiety was instantly replaced with pure terror. The psychological toll was immediate and crushing. Within hours of entering the line, Captain Robert L. Amano was lost. This forced Lieutenant Thomas Williamson, a VMI graduate, to assume command of a company. The company was already reeling from heavy casualties. The fighting on that first day, though costly, was relentless. The company achieved the largest ground gain of the Battle of the Bulge up to that point. They covered 5 miles and captured over 100 exhausted German soldiers. But the cost was compounded by a crippling technological disparity. The widely used M4 Sherman, armed with its 75mm gun, was dangerously outmatched. Its shells possessed less than half the velocity and explosive force of the German 88mm cannon. While the Sherman's powered turret offered speed, its thin armor and inferior gun meant disaster. German heavy tanks could penetrate the American vehicles from any angle. This turned the Shermans into death traps. They earned the grim nickname Ronson Lighters. This technological inferiority underscored the massive material and human losses the division sustained in its first weeks. The grim reality of mortality settled over the troops on December 31st. This was during the fierce struggle for Chinon. Chinon was a village that would be almost completely leveled. It lost 29 of its 31 homes and its church. It was here that the narrator first saw a dead American soldier. That sight instantly transformed the abstract concept of war into a visceral, sickening trauma. New Year's Eve brought no truce. It brought only an intense artillery barrage that rained down on the refueling operations. This was a constant reminder that danger was pervasive, even in the briefest moments of rest. Chinon was finally captured on New Year's Day 1945. The company pushed forward. They were hit by a rocket attack near Mandé-Saint-Étienne on January 2nd. This attack tragically killed 2 men, puncturing a deceptive silence. On January 3rd, the exhausted company was relieved by the 17th Airborne Division. They were sent to Barracuda, Belgium. This brief respite offered a momentary return to sanity. They enjoyed hot chocolate made with fresh milk. They shared moments of poker. They made a desperate effort to scrub the mud and blood from their gear. But the lull was short-lived. On January 12th, they were ordered back to the front. The advance through the forest funnel toward Mandé-Saint-Étienne was treacherous. German anti-tank ambushes were lurking in the swampy ground. This was exacerbated by the bitter cold that caused frostbite and made vehicle operations sluggish. The true disaster struck on January 14th at Noville. A communication error had ordered the company to advance into the town at night. This tactical blunder led directly into a devastating ambush. 12 tanks entered the town at dusk. Only 5 survived the night. Burning Shermans blocked the escape routes. The crews were forced into a chaotic, desperate retreat on foot. The narrator's own tank became stuck in the freezing terrain. In the ensuing pandemonium, they rescued Eugene Baudouin. Baudouin's eyes were burned by a bazooka blast. They guided him back toward friendly lines. Other crewmen, like Lawrence, Leslie, and Wayne Van Dyke, survived by playing dead amidst the patrolling German soldiers. Among the tanks lost that night was the Barracuda. While advancing near Noville, the tank bogged down in the deep marsh. The marsh was hidden beneath the snow and ice. Immobilized, it was hit by a Panzerfaust, but the crew managed to continue fighting until a German Panther tank delivered the fatal blow. This set the Sherman ablaze. Driver Andrew Erder and assistant driver Ivan Goldstein escaped the burning wreck. They plunged into the icy water to avoid the flames. Shivering and exposed, they were soon captured. They were interrogated by a German major who spoke perfect English. They were coolly informed of their impending execution and sentenced to be shot. They were marched out to a field. The German firing squad was preparing to end their war. Fate intervened violently at that moment. An American artillery barrage crashed down around them, interrupting the execution. In the ensuing confusion, Erda and Goldstein were spared. They began a grueling imprisonment. This included a 50-mile march in freezing conditions with no food. They were confined to a pigsty, suffering severe malnutrition. They were finally freed by advancing American troops in April 1945. Despite the immense struggles and human cost, the soldiers' tenacity proved greater than the German offensive. On January 16th, new tanks arrived. Some were equipped with the desperately needed, improved 76mm guns. Although the narrator's replacement tank was immediately hit by an artillery strike, wounding him with shrapnel, the division continued to press forward. The eventual success of the Allied forces in closing the bulge was cemented by the immense bravery and adaptability of these soldiers. This culminated in the historic meeting of the 11th Armored Division Cavalry with U.S. First Army troops. This signaled the end of Hitler's last desperate throw of the dice. The division had endured its brutal baptism by fire. They emerged, battered but unbroken, ready for the relentless push into Germany. The stabilization of the bulge in late January 1945 did not bring peace. It initiated a relentless, grinding push east. This forced the 11th Armored Division to shift from desperate defense to aggressive invasion. By early February, the company found a temporary staging area in Binsfeld, Luxembourg. This landscape of beautiful, rolling countryside stood in stark, unsettling contrast to the nearby, persistent war. The men, still chilled from the Ardennes, struggled with the cold. Their standard-issue gloves proved useless against the damp, penetrating air. Necessity became the mother of invention. The narrator crafted crude but effective mittens from strips of an army blanket. Others relied on the care packages from home. One example was the pair Clayt Shaw's received from his mother. The next great obstacle was the Siegfried Line. This formidable defense was a vast network of concrete bunkers, connecting pillboxes and the infamous Dragon's Teeth pylons. It was designed to be impenetrable. The infantry assault began on February 18th. It was a slow and costly process that took weeks to carve a path through the obstacles. The tankers waited, chafing at the delay, until the ground was finally cleared for their heavy machinery. By March 1st, the division crossed the Our River and entered Germany. The moment was marked less by fanfare and more by the grim realization that they were now deep inside the enemy heartland. The pace quickened dramatically. General George S. Patton, Jr., an imposing and demanding presence, was frequently seen observing the roadwork. He expected crisp salutes and relentless efficiency. The logistical strain became immense. Fuel and ammunition were constantly stretched thin. But the Army's industrial might was now fully engaged. The sheer capacity of the American war machine to replace lost tanks and keep the advancing columns supplied increasingly tipped the strategic balance. This, coupled with absolute Allied air superiority, neutralized the tactical advantage of the few remaining German heavy tanks. On March 29th, the company reached Oppenheim. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and diesel. They were tasked with crossing the Rhine River. This was a profound, symbolic milestone that marked the invasion of the German interior. The narrator, driving a 33-ton Sherman, felt a knot of high tension. He maneuvered the massive vehicle across the temporary pontoon bridge. The broad expanse of the water rushed beneath the metal planks. The advance was a marathon, often covering 30 to 40 miles a day. But the speed did not mitigate the brutality of the fighting. Near Gelnhausen on March 30th, the column encountered heavy resistance. At Hauswurz, the town was a roaring inferno. It was here that the narrator's tank was hit by a Panzerfaust projectile. The impact was deafening. The interior instantly filled with smoke and the metallic stench of burning paint and fuel. The crew scrambled out, abandoning the burning Sherman. This was a visceral, terrifying experience. It reminded them that the enemy, though collapsing, was still capable of lethal strikes. April 1st, 1945, would be remembered as Bloody Easter. Detached and attached to an armoured infantry unit, the crew fought 40 miles deeper into Germany. The ground gained came at a horrific price. They pushed through a landscape littered with the dead and dying. It was a gruesome scene where masses of German soldiers had fallen. This left the entire field appearing to move with the sheer volume of casualties. Despite the carnage, the American advance continued. It was driven by adrenaline and the grim mandate to keep moving. The push became a blur of capturing key infrastructure. This included the Walther pistol factory and a major communication hub. Amidst the intense fighting, small moments of normalcy broke through. The crew discovered a cache of fresh eggs. They enjoyed a banquet of fried eggs and bacon cooked on a camp stove nestled in the turret. But the relentless, victorious advance brought the soldiers face to face with the true, moral core of the war. As the 11th Armored Division pushed into Austria, they began to uncover the unimaginable. Near the town of Linz, the cavalry reconnaissance troops found the Mauthausen concentration camp. The sight was a profound, immediate psychological shock. Mauthausen, established in 1938, was a death factory. 195,000 people had passed through. They were subjected to slave labor in the nearby Wiener Graben granite quarry. Their diets consisted of gruel and sawdust bread. The soldiers found a crematorium still smoking, with human remains visible in the oven. The gas chamber was disguised, chillingly, as a shower room. Outside, stacks of bodies, emaciated and frozen, were piled high like cordwood. The liberated prisoners, the few who had survived, were ghost-like. Their eyes were sunken, and their teeth were black and crumbling from malnutrition. The sheer scale of the atrocity was undeniable and overwhelming. It instantly transformed the often confused purpose of the war into a clear-eyed moral imperative. General Holmes E. Dager, the division commander, recognized the gravity of the discovery. He issued an extraordinary order. All units were to see Mauthausen. Every soldier, including the tank crews, was forced to confront the smoking ovens and the walking skeletons. This ensured that no man could ever romanticize or forget the true nature of the enemy they had fought. The horror instilled a lasting, deep disrespect for the perpetrators. This led to immediate and brutal reprisals against SS soldiers encountered nearby. Over 1,000 SS soldiers were swiftly captured. Yet, even as the war's purpose solidified, the human cost continued. On May 1st, advancing into Austria near Lembach, Company A encountered a heavily defended roadblock. In the ensuing firefight, Captain Scott, a widely respected company commander, was killed in action. His death, so close to the end, broke the morale of the men. Colonel Wesley W. Yale, known as Doctor, responded with a chilling retaliatory order. This underscored the psychological toll of the final months. 6 villages ahead were to be burned to the ground. It was a harsh lesson delivered to the inhabitants that resistance was useless. The end came not with a bang, but with a flood. By May 3rd, near Zwettl, the organized German resistance simply dissolved. Thousands of German soldiers, including an entire army corps of 18,000 men, voluntarily surrendered. They poured into the American lines. They were desperate to avoid the advancing Soviet army. They feared the anticipated brutal treatment from the Soviets more than American captivity. On May 8, 1945, VE Day arrived. Rumors had been circulating for days. The official confirmation brought a moment of profound, exhausted relief. General Patton issued a memo. It reflected on the Third Army's 281 days of constant battle. It praised the fighting heart of the American soldier. The 11th Armored Division had logged 1,000 combat miles from its baptism at the Bulge. It had captured 76,229 prisoners. It had liberated 52,500 slave laborers. The fighting was over. But for the men who had driven their tanks into the heart of darkness and witnessed the unspeakable, the war had just begun its long, complex psychological aftermath. The formal cessation of hostilities on May 8, 1945, marked VE Day, but it offered no clean break for the soldiers of the 11th Armored Division. The adrenaline-fueled clarity of combat gave way to the complex, morally ambiguous fog of the Army of Occupation. The transition was immediate and immense. It shifted the focus from killing the enemy to managing the aftermath of a collapsed civilization. This role was fraught with logistical and moral challenges. The immediate humanitarian crisis was staggering. The 11th Armored Division alone had liberated over 52,500 slave laborers and 5,012 Allied POWs. These were displaced persons. Many were starved and medically fragile. They required immediate care, organization, and repatriation. The soldiers, who had just weeks earlier been fighting for their lives, were now tasked with providing food, security, and rudimentary medical aid. They served these ghost-like figures emerging from the camps. One of the most challenging and disturbing tasks involved guarding and moving the newly captured German forces. Under strict orders from the Allied High Command, Americans had to prevent German soldiers from falling into Soviet hands east of Linz. The Americans established a blockade. This policy led to the morally complex scenario of marching approximately 18,000 German prisoners toward the demarcation line. This entire army corps was guarded by only 36 tanks. The column stretched over 6 miles long. It was a desperate, moving mass of men using everything from horse-drawn wagons to captured trucks. In the hot spring weather, the limited water supply was inadequate. Water was doled out from army tank trailers. With no food provided, many prisoners suffered from heat stroke and exhaustion. The American soldiers, though hardened by combat, faced the uncomfortable reality of watching men suffer. They were enforcing a policy dictated by geopolitical maneuvering. The first tangible sign that the fighting was truly finished came when the order arrived for the tank crews to turn in their tanks and heavy weapons. For J. Ted Hartman, the M4 Sherman had been a cramped, vulnerable, yet ultimately protective steel shell. Now, the routine of maintenance, the constant checks of the engine and the cleaning of the 75mm gun was abruptly replaced by the final act of demobilization. The silence that followed the removal of their combat gear was profound. It was a sudden, unnerving absence of the mechanical roar and the constant threat of enemy fire that had defined their lives for months. The unit settled into occupation duties. They initially camped outside Nuremberg. Hartmann was then assigned as company clerk in Wassertrudingen for 3 months. The soldiers were housed in German barracks. Later, they were moved to the luxurious and slightly surreal setting of a monastery in Kremsmünster. This period was characterized by a pathological boredom. The days were filled with dull, repetitive, close-order drill and tank maintenance on the few remaining vehicles. These tasks were punctuated by patrols. The patrols served mostly to remind the German populace of the American presence. The contrast between the occupiers and the occupied was stark. While German civilians struggled with shortages and the debris of war, American soldiers enjoyed relative abundance. This included fresh accommodations and access to captured spoils of war. The monastery in Kremsmünster, for instance, revealed hallways filled with immense collections of looted goods. This included contemporary French sterling silver services. It was a chilling reminder of the war's deeper criminality. Even in the relative quiet of occupation, the military's commitment to accountability continued. Several months after VE Day, the Counterintelligence Corps moved with silent, remarkable speed. Relying on intelligence gathered from local informants, they executed a midnight raid. The target was Harry Tamiya, a former Nazi Kreisleiter. He was on the Nuremberg war crimes list for his role in the killing of 2 downed Canadian flyers. This operation underscored that while the fighting had stopped, the pursuit of justice had not. Hartmann's tenure as company clerk was briefly interrupted. He accepted the role of first sergeant for 3 weeks. He took this position not for ambition, but specifically to shield his men from less desirable leadership. Despite the relative comfort of their postings, the physical and psychological toll of the war persisted. Hartmann was constantly reminded of the Battle of the Bulge's brutality. He suffered from the lingering effects of the frostbite he had sustained in the deep snows of December 1940. This made the cold of the occupation winter a constant, uncomfortable companion. The longing for home, however, was the dominant emotion. The army, recognizing the need to transition soldiers back to civilian life, established educational programs. Hartmann found his reprieve by enrolling in the October through December 1945 term at Biarritz American University. He traded the drabness of the German barracks for the resort hotels of the French coast. He experienced a brief, luxurious interlude. French waiters served delicious meals. He immersed himself in college-level courses, including German, chemistry, and piano. This academic phase was a vital bridge. It was a chance to reconnect with intellectual pursuits and civilian society. This was exemplified by a poignant trip to the French countryside. There, a forester remarked that even the trees seemed to appreciate their liberty. The interlude was abruptly terminated 2 days before Christmas. Biarritz American University closed. Hartmann returned to Germany, facing 2 more months of monotonous waiting in Nuremberg. Finally, in early February 1946, his orders arrived. The journey home was anticlimactic and deeply uncomfortable. He endured 3 days in the infamous 40 and 8 freight cars. These were the cramped, unventilated boxcars designed to hold 40 men or 8 horses. Though crudely winterized with a small coal stove, the cars were miserable. Yet the discomfort was irrelevant. The collective sentiment that overrode all hardship was, "Never mind, we were going home." On March 2, 1946, he boarded the troop transport ship New Bern Victory. The 8-day voyage was comparatively restful. It offered decent food and adequate accommodations. Disembarking in New York, he completed his final military processing at Camp Grant. He received his discharge on March 14, 1946. This was nearly 3 years after his initial broken promise of a university education. He arrived in Ames, Iowa, the following day. He was a veteran of the Ardennes, the Rhine crossings, and the liberation of Mauthausen. He was ready to begin the long, quiet process of adjusting to a peace he had helped secure. The war ended in the spring of 1945, but the psychological conflict endured for decades. For J. Ted Hartman, like countless others, the memories of the Ardennes remained indelible. These included the deep snow, the freezing cold inside the Sherman where frost coated the interior walls, and the chilling sight of burning buildings. The memoir itself was a testament to this enduring impact. It was a necessary accounting of the immense human cost of armored warfare. It was a solemn obligation to remember lost comrades. Decades later, the call to remembrance brought Hartman back to the green, peaceful landscape of Belgium. It was a land utterly transformed from the shattered, snow-choked wilderness he had last known. His return was not just for emotional closure, it was for a crucial act of historical correction concerning one of the most visible symbols of the battle. This was the M4 Sherman tank displayed prominently in McAuliffe Square in Bastogne. This specific tank, recovered in 1948, had long been mistakenly attributed to the storied 4th Armored Division. But the records, the recollections, and the location of its destruction near Noville confirmed its true heritage. It was the Barracuda, a veteran of the 11th Armored Division, 41st Tank Battalion. The correction was vital not for divisional pride, but for historical truth. It ensured that the sacrifices of the men who had been rushed to the front as immediate exhausted reserves were properly recognized. On May 30, 2000, Belgian Memorial Day, Hartman returned to Bastogne for the rededication ceremony. The square, named for the general who famously replied nuts to the German surrender demand, was filled with local officials, veterans, and grateful citizens. It was a profound contrast to the chaos of 1944. It was a peaceful gathering where the only sounds were the rustle of flags and the formal addresses of remembrance. Local officials, Robert Fergloot and Roger Marquette, hosted the event. This underscored the deep, enduring gratitude of the Belgian people. The ceremony centered on the unveiling of a new plaque. This plaque confirmed the tank's correct identity. As the plaque was revealed, the national anthems played. They wove together the history of two nations bound by blood and liberation. The emotional climax of the day arrived not with the booming of guns, but with a quiet human reunion. Standing near the newly recognized Barracuda, Hartman found himself face-to-face with Ivan Goldstein. Goldstein was his old friend and assistant driver from the 11th Armored. He had not seen him in over 50 years. Goldstein was one of the 2 crewmen who had escaped the burning tank that frigid night in Noville. He had endured the icy water and narrowly survived a summary execution by a German firing squad. He had then suffered months of brutal imprisonment and malnutrition. Their reunion was a silent, powerful testament to the bonds forged under fire. It was a shared memory of terror and survival that transcended the decades. During the ceremony, Hartman was also honored with the Medal of Freedom of Bastogne. This was a symbolic recognition from the community his division had helped save. Hartman reflected on the cost. He recalled that one company of the 55th Armored Infantry Battalion of the 11th Armored Division had lost 40 men out of 200 during the vicious fight for the village of Tillet in 1945. The enduring gratitude of the Belgian people stood in stark contrast to the modern American disconnect from such distant